King, comfort of the Spirit, true to giver, president, full of all things, treasure of blessings, and giver of life. Come and abide us and cleanse us from every impurity, and save our souls, O God. Well, does anybody have any questions from last time?
I heard one. Yeah, you had a question.
I don't know if it's related to the topic that you took last
It was one from last week.
Okay.
It's a good question, though.
I was just curious when the Western and Eastern rites diverged, because I believe it was well prior to the schism, wasn't it? No, long before. Actually, they just developed separately. Okay. The Western rite developed out of the ritual tradition of the Church of Rome, whereas the Eastern rite, so-called, developed out of the traditions of the Church coming out of Antioch, Jerusalem, and Constantinople. And so now when of course the Latin Church, and we'll deal a little bit still with the schism. The Latin Church separated itself from the Orthodox Church really in 1204, technically. But when you're talking about, for example, like Eastern Rite Catholicism versus Orthodoxy, like the Eastern rites in the Catholic Church, that all comes after after 1589. And so we'll talk a little bit about some of that. Mm-hmm. But there were three or four major traditions, liturgical traditions in the ancient church. There was the Greek tradition coming out of Jerusalem, Antioch, and eventually Constantinople. The Latin tradition coming out of Carthage and Rome. The Syriac tradition coming out of Edessa and Syria, eastern Syria. Then there were other smaller or less influential traditions like the Coptic tradition. Then the Ethiopic tradition developed, and then there were various and sundry traditions that had their root in the Syriac missionaries coming out of the Syriac tradition from the Church of the East. And so you had the Malankar Indian liturgical tradition. You have then there was and who knows what the liturgy was like in China in the 8th century. We don't know, but it was there and it was powerful, and it was a huge church at the time, and Afghanistan and Tibet and all of these places. So basically where we are is we're still circling around the 14th century, dipping back a little bit. So we talked about the Fourth Crusade, the sacking of Constantinople. Now there was a predecessor to that, which was rather, shall we say, the approximate cause of the Fourth Crusade, and that was called the Slaughter of the Latins, that happened in 1192. There was a battle going on between two factions for the imperial throne of Constantinople, and the Latins in the city, and there were a considerable number of Latins, backed one side, and the side that prevailed was not happy about that, and so there was actually some kind of mass slaughter, and that's where they took the head of the papal legate and tied it to a dog's tail and drove the dog around the city. So that didn't sit too well, to say the least. Those were brutal times. Even in a place as urbane and sophisticated as Constantinople, which it was. This was the premier city of the world. It was. They were subject to. It was at times subject to great cruelty. So the Fourth Crusade was, among other things, payback. And the payback essentially destroyed the Roman Empire. What was left of it. And what it did is it set it up for the Turkish Islamic conquest, which wouldn't happen finally until 1453, but there was a, let's see, there was a massive depopulation of the city, and especially after the Latin conquest, and it just and things went downhill from there. The empire was reduced basically to Constantinople and its environs, and Thessalonica, and a thin little strip of land between the two. And that was it, from having governed the entire Mediterranean basin. So, it was a very sad thing. Now, at this time, during the Latin yoke, which lasted in Constantinople between 1204 and 1268, which is when the Greeks took back control of the city. Between those times, there was the Council of Lyon, which we talked about. It was the first major ecumenical council to try and bring the churches back together. So if you think about it, you had the sack of the city in 1204, and at that time the Latins rejected the Greek hierarchy and installed their own hierarchy, so that Hagia Sophia in Constantinople was turned into a Roman Catholic Church, and remained such until 1268. The Greeks finally took it back in 1268. But then just 4 years later, in 4 years, think about the communication time in the Mediterranean basin in the 13th century. I mean, it took a letter a long time to go either by boat or by messenger from Constantinople to Rome or to Avignon or wherever. I think the papacy was in Avignon at the time. So communications were slow, but still there was this ecumenical council which tried to ram Roman Catholicism down the throats of the Orthodox, and the Orthodox rejected it. And so nothing really came of that council, except on the Latin side, they redefined the procession of the Holy Spirit. And that became, and that's when the doctrine of the Filioque became heretical. Up until that time, the doctrine of the Filioque could be understood in an Orthodox manner. And Saint Maximus the Confessor in the 7th century even had a treatise defending the Filioque as a legitimate expression of how
how it could be understood in an Orthodox manner. Everybody knows what the Filioque is, right? It was the Roman Catholic, the Latin addition to the Creed, which said that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father, Filioque, and from the Son, which is an addition that was put in the year 567 in the Council of Toledo. It was uncanonical for that council to add anything to the Creed. It was that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father is simply a quote from the Gospel of St. John. So so that's not really a legitimate addition. But what they were trying to do is to illustrate and strengthen the idea of the relationship between the Father and the Son.
Do you think that was because of the Arians?
Yes, because of the Arians. Because the Arians had been exiled from the empire, and where did they go? Into barbarian lands. And what did they do? They converted people. So a lot of the Germanic tribes that swept down into Italy, into Gaul, into Iberia, in other words, Spain, and into North Africa from there, had been Arians. And so there was this kind of renewed Arian controversy in the 7th century, 6th, 7th century. Anyway, the Filioque had become a rallying cry for the Germanic tribes, like the Franks and the Goths of the various kinds of Visigoths and Ostrogoths and so on and so forth. But it was never used in the city of Rome until 1016, when the first German was elected pope. And then after that, it became a kind of a rallying point for the Western Church. It was actually then in the 11th century that it really started becoming a problem. Now, albeit that it could be understood in an Orthodox manner. In the 13th century, at the Council of Lyon, they redefined it. Instead of, because the Orthodox theology that was universally agreed upon was that the Father is the single source, and the word is monarch. Monarch does not just mean king, it means single source of the Trinity. That the Father has always generates his Son, and the Spirit always proceeds from the Father. Both the Father and the Son, or both the Son and the Spirit come forth from the Father and have their source in the Father. And so, and that is part of their essential personal characteristic that defines them as separate persons. In 1272, the triangle was kind of flipped up. And so they said that the Father and the Son both generate the Holy Spirit, and the Holy Spirit proceeds from them as from a single source. So, what does this do? It lessens the personhood of the Holy Spirit, because it deprives him of a characteristic that is common to the Father and the Son. In other words, Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit we understand as sharing the same essence, right? One essence. Homoousios. And so, if the Father and the Son both are sources of the Holy Spirit, then there's something lacking in the Holy Spirit. And so in Latin theology, the Holy Spirit was defined as the bond of love between the Father and the Son. Well, that's very nice, You know, that's Augustine. That's very nice. It's kind of sweet, you know. But that doesn't make him, that's not very personal. There's no personhood in that. And so the Holy Spirit becomes this kind of energy. And remember we talked about in the Palamite controversies last week that according to the Latins, according to the Latin-minded, to Varlam, that the Holy Spirit really is the uncreated energy of the Father, or the uncreated energy of God. Again, not personal. So, that's a big problem. That's a big problem. So, once again, you have a duality, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Doesn't work. Not in Orthodox theology. Orthodox theology always thinks in terms of triads, not duality. Because with duality, it's always easy to slip into this kind of black-white, good, evil, male, female, matter, spirit, and everything lines up, and pretty soon you're a Gnostic. Where you equate all that is good and holy and true with the white, with the male, with the with the spiritual, with the you see what I'm getting at? Okay. In Orthodox theology, there are no such kind of neat dualistic categories. Orthodox theology is not dualistic, it's non-dual. And this is not a category that's developed in Western philosophy because they just don't go there. They don't. I don't think they understand it, and it's not really developed as a category in Greek philosophy, but it's used throughout. It's not developed as a specific category, but it's used throughout the entire system of thought. What's interesting is it's developed in Hindu theology, but we won't go there. And very extensively. And so there's actually some very great parallels between Greek monastic thought, Greek Orthodox thought, and regarding the Trinity and regarding the union with God and deification, and Hinduism. Or rather, not Hinduism, but some categories of highly sophisticated Hindu philosophy. Okay, it's not that Orthodoxy is related to going around with Shiva and all of this kind of stuff. It has nothing to do with that.
I heard it depicted that as far as non-dualistic, that like instead of referring it to light and darkness, that you have light and then you have the absence of light.
Right.
So that was
that's not a dualistic category.
correct.
And so you have good and the absence of good, which is what evil is. And you have Christ saying, "The Father, I and my Father are one." Well, okay, how do you understand that? In dualistic categories, it makes no sense at all, because there's 1 plus 1. And the Trinity is 1 plus 1 plus 1, that means 3, right? No, it means 1. So, right, so, anyway, so the whole philosophy, the whole theological understanding of the Trinity was severely damaged in Western theology by the Council of Lyon. And that's very important to understand. And at this same time, in the West, you had, was kind of the flowering of scholastic theology. Now, on the way to the Council of Lyon, St. Thomas Aquinas died, having written hundreds of volumes. And at the end of his life, he had a vision of Christ. And he said, and he never wrote again. And he said, all my writings are as straw. Because he encountered the living Christ.
Wow.
Now,
That says a lot.
remember, we're talking about this all now in the preparation for Palamite theology in the East. What is hesychasm about? It's about entering into the radiant darkness in order to encounter the living Christ. It's the whole point. It's into the radiant darkness, and it's into the melodious silence, and into the think of the antinomies and put them together, and you've got, and then there's no other way to describe it than poetry. And so one of the greatest early theologians of hesychasm, a predecessor to the hesychast movement, which really was 14th century, was St. Simeon the New Theologian. And almost all of his works are written in poetry. And it's very lucky because he didn't have a really super duper education, and so you can actually read his Greek poetry with a mediocre American grasp of Byzantine Greek. Unlike the poetry of even the services, some of which is written in such complex Byzantine Greek that even God can't figure it out. I'm sure it's hopeless. Actually, the translators to Slavonic couldn't figure it out. Some of it. Anyway, so what's going on in Constantinople is, Council of Lyon, all these dialogues with the Latins, this close encounters of an unpleasant kind in post Fourth Crusade Constantinople. You've got huge numbers of Venetians and Genoese and other Latin merchants controlling large parts of the city, and Latin Roman Catholic orders setting up their houses and their missionaries all over the place, and then you've got this vague threat of the Turks coming from the east. You've got marauding Latins, and then you've got the Muslims from the south, and so it was a difficult time. On top of that, there were all sorts of pirates. One of the things, I think I mentioned it last time, that St. Gregory Palamas, towards the end of his life, which was I think around 1360, was imprisoned by Muslim pirates for 2 years. But there was he used it fruitfully, and he had dialogues with the Sufis, and that would have been very interesting. Anyway, so the 1340s and through 50s were the Palamite councils, Polemos finally he dies, but after he finally was able to assume his episcopal throne in Thessaloniki, and the empire is limping along with all of these sort of. Now, let's switch a couple thousand miles north. In Russia, in 1237, from 988, which is when Prince Vladimir, or dare I say Valdemar, and his Viking princess Helga, had brought Orthodox Christianity to Russia. It was the baptism in the Dnieper, and thousands of people were baptized at that point, and Byzantine missionaries were recruited and went deep into Russia to baptize and to catechize the people. They were using the books translated by Saint Cyril and Methodius, and there was this whole process of the Christianization of Rus. Now there was also going on, or there had also gone on, the process of the Christianization of Bulgaria and Serbia, and in the Orthodox part, of and the Romanians. I'm not sure about the history. I just don't know the history at all. But Slavic Orthodoxy was becoming very strong. Now, these new Slavic kingdoms were threatened by the Turks. But it wasn't until the 14th century, really, end of the 14th century, that the Turks started coming in and taking over, conquering the Christian kingdoms and installing Muslim rule, submitting them to a caliphate. In Russia, there was a different dynamic. In the year 1237, through 1240, there was an invasion of the Mongols, Genghis Khan. Now, one of the things that's also important to know that while the Balkan countries initially were eventually threatened by the Turks, initially they too were conquered by the Mongols. And so the Mongol Empire went basically from the Danube all the way across Asia. And it's interesting, Genghis Khan was the founder. His mother was a Christian, a Syriac Christian. And the Mongols actually were very tolerant. There were Christians, there were shamans, shamanic people, and there were Muslims, and they didn't force people into their religion. 1237, Batu Khan started the invasion of Russia, and most of the cities of Russia were destroyed. There were, the cities were burned, mass rape, pillage, and looting, and they were brought to, the Russians were brought to their knees. And all of these cities, because they were all city-states, were made vassals of the Golden Horde. And so from the mid-13th century, the princes of these city-states were responsible to the to the Mongol overlords for the collection of taxes according to a certain, and the amount was determined according to a census, and things actually were fairly organized. Now, up until the point of the Mongol invasions, the Russian princes were just fighting among themselves, and it was just kind of constant internecine warfare, brother against brother. So the Mongols actually brought a relative amount of peace, like the peace of Islam. As long as Islam is in charge, there's peace. You rebel against Islam, there's no peace. Now, sometimes the Mongol yoke is called the Tartar yoke. The Tartars were a Turkic people. The Mongols, of course, are from Mongolia. But the Tartars were swept up into the Mongol invasions and collaborated and worked with the Mongols in their invasion, rape, looting, and pillage of all of these cities of Russia and going into Europe. But what they finally established was basically this system of tribute, where on one hand you had the horde camped kind of on the edge of the Russian civilized area. They were also they also didn't come in very often, probably more often than they wanted to, or than the Russians would have liked, but take care. But when they did come in, it usually was to exact tribute, or if somehow there had been some slight against the rulers, that probably didn't go over very well. But this context of the Mongol yoke isolated Russia, and by Russia I say all the lands of Rus. And it's interesting too, because the part of the heritage from the Mongol Tartar yoke was the development of three distinct parts of the Russian world: Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia, and northern Russia. Each with a slightly different dialects, each with their own kind of unique history, because they were under separate divisions of the Mongol Empire. But it's also interesting that about this same time, the Mongol leader sent to the Pope and offered to do a joint crusade against Islam to liberate the Holy Land. Of course, the Christians had lost the Holy Land. Islam had swept back in and obliterated the Christian kingdoms. But the Muslims thought, or the Mongols thought, that they might give it another go. So, but because there were enough Christians among them that they were interested in a new crusade. But the West was not interested. They had enough of that. So, in this context, somewhere between 1316 and 1322, St. Sergius of Rodinez was born. And he was born near Rostov. His parents became dispossessed. They were part of the aristocracy, but they became dispossessed, and so they moved north to and landed in the village of Radonej, which is it's about 70 kilometers northeast of Moscow. Saint Sergius, he basically grew up there in that area as a boy. He was very bright, but he had trouble learning how to read. And there's a miraculous story of the elder visiting and giving him a piece of prospera, and he was immediately enabled to read, and when he was 6, and so that's seen as an event marking the life of Saint Sergius. When he was in his late teens, he approached his brother, who was a monk at a monastery not too far away, to go to build a skeet in the forest. And so they went into the woods about 3 or 4 miles north of where they lived. Now the woods in Russia at the time, and still now, are incredibly dense. So 3 or 4 miles through the woods, if there's no road, is a long way. And so they went to a certain hill and started to build a skeet. His brother Stephen found it was too difficult, and so he went back to the monastery where he had been living, and Saint Sergius remained there alone as a hermit in the woods. So there's all these stories about a bear coming up and befriending him, and various and sundry tales of hermit life in the woods. Well, very soon other monks had heard of him and came and found him, and they started building cells nearby, which meant that they had to hew down the trees themselves and cut them up into logs and build cabins and things like that. A lot of work. But soon a whole community started to grow there in the woods, and they built a church which they had blessed in the name of the Trinity. So Church of the Holy Trinity. And so to this day, the monastery is called the Monastery, the Lavra now, of the Holy Trinity and Saint Sergius. It's one of the great landmarks of the Orthodox world, and especially the Russian Orthodox Church. The place under the Soviet period used to be called Zagorsk, which is the name of some Soviet general. Yeah. Saint Sergius attracted the attention of Metropolitan Alexis of Moscow, who was one of the who is a saint and one of the greatest of the metropolitans of Moscow, much beloved, and eventually a gramota, or rather a charter for the monastery was sent to him from the Patriarch of Constantinople. The Russian Church was under Constantinople at this time. So this is around the time of the Palamite controversies, which is, probably 1340s, 1350s. So there was a lot going on. In 1380, in 1380, there was a great battle with the Tartars, And on the Russian side was Prince Dmitry Donskoy. And he came to St. Sergius and asked for his blessing to do battle with the Tartars to try and drive them out of Russia. And it was the Battle of Kulikova Polya, Kulikova Field. And St. Sergius gave him his blessing, and also sent 2 monks, 2 warrior monks. And it's very interesting in the iconography to see these 2 monks in the great schema with swords and spears. And I don't remember the names of the 2 monks.
Teresiet and Osliapiet
Okay.
in Russian, but they had Orthodox names too. One was
Yeah.
Alexander, and I don't remember the other one.
So, so there is a history even of monks going off to battle, and this would, in a fairly short time, show itself in the defense of the city of Constantinople. So, 1380, the Battle of Kulikova Polya, it began the driving back of the Golden Horde. But it wasn't complete until 1480, when they had what was called the Great Stand at the Ugra River. And it was kind of the final battle for the driving out of the horde. The Tartars, however, remained, and Tartars and Mongols basically were kind of completely intermixed by this time. So they're 2 totally different peoples, totally different cultures. And there's huge Tartar influence in the Russian population and in the in various parts of the in various parts of Russia. So the Cossacks actually were part of the Tartars. There were Tartar families that became Russian nobility. So it's and names that would be familiar to you if you know anything of Russian history. So it's quite interesting, how the Russians dealt with this, the Mongol overlords. And there's also an interesting element in that it's a kind of enduring thing that the Russians tend to have a sense that they're an Eastern culture and not simply a Western culture. That there's a large Eastern influence in Russian culture, and you do see certain parts of that. And then certainly you can see it in the faces of the people. Russia is as much of a melting pot as America is, only it's a different mix. It's an Asian mix as opposed to a European African mix, and so you've got the entire spectrum of people from the Caucasus all the way to the Pacific. So so it's a very and there are cultural elements and things that.
So this developed from the Mongol overlords coming in?
Yeah, for 250 years.
Okay.
It's a long time.
Yeah.
It's a long time. Okay, back to St. Sergius. St. Sergius made many disciples, and his monastery grew, and it grew very large. And he actually seeded the development of monasteries. 40 monasteries directly were founded by his disciples. He himself was responsible for for the establishment of about 5 monasteries, 2 in the city of Moscow, the Lavra, and a couple of others nearby. There's another story about St. Sergius where the brothers were fighting, and it was during liturgy, and he didn't say anything, but he at the end of the liturgy he took off his vestments and walked out the door, and he kept walking, and he walked out the gate, and he kept walking, and he walked until he went to a place and he founded another monastery. And it took
with his feet.
and it took the brothers a while to realize he's serious. You know? Go away.
Serious.
Turn off the listening ear.
Lord have mercy. Nothing like an electronic voice interjecting itself. And so, ultimately the brothers repented, and Saint Sergius came back to the monastery. But it was evidently a rather remarkable incident in the life of that community. He was offered to become a bishop. He turned it down. He was offered by St. Alexis, Metropolitan of Moscow, and turned it down. And finally he died in 1392. Probably one of the most important things about St. Sergius and is that he manifested and pioneered the monastic missionization model for northern Russia. Now, Russia, you think of Slavs, but in the northern forests, they're not Slavs, they're Finns, and various Finnish tribes. And of course, the further north you go, there are more Finnish tribes. Well, they eventually got incorporated into the Russian community to a great extent because St. Sergius sent monks into the wilderness. The monks thought they would have peace and quiet. They didn't. So they built a little skeet and were, happily doing the Jesus prayer, I'm sure, or some, and doing their prayers, and people would start coming. And pretty soon a village would develop around the monastery, and then the village would turn into a small city. And the monks said, "Hey, we tried to escape this," and the people would come to the monastery. They would initially be attracted because they liked how they were treated. They were treated with respect, they were treated honestly, they were treated with honor, and that wasn't the usual way that, simple people were treated otherwise. And so that provided an opening for them to Christianity. And so they would be evangelized, they would be baptized, and become members of the church. And as they became members of the church, they would adopt Russian and the Russian ways, and pretty soon that whole area was incorporated into Russia, into the Russian cultural sphere, even though ethnically the people were Finns, or Finnish. Now, it also helps that Russian is a much easier language to learn than Finnish, I think. Finnish is hopeless. Has 24 cases or something like that. Russian has 7, or Slavonic has 7. But this pattern of missionization is a classic pattern of Orthodox missionization. It was also used by St. Patrick in Ireland. The same basic thing. The monks would go out, they would establish a monastery, the people would come around, they liked how they were treated, they would convert to Christianity, and then the monks thought it's too crowded and move on. And some of them would move on. And of course some would stay. But this also created a whole network of settlements as well. Because some of those tribes living up there weren't exactly stable. They didn't exactly live in villages. They lived in they were semi-nomadic, following the reindeer, which was a kind of general pattern all the way from Lapland all the way across northern Asia, right? It's said that between St. Sergius and his disciples and their disciples, over 200 of these major monasteries were established. And it's everything from the Andronikov Monastery in Moscow to the Kirilo-Belozersk Monastery at White Lake, which is way northeast of Moscow, and all sorts of places in between, and today the Trinity St. Sergius Lavra remains at the very heart and soul of the Russian Orthodox Church. During the Soviet period, the first Stalin, it was closed, and then Stalin reopened it in 1944. The relics of St. Sergius were returned, at least what was left of them, and the monastery was able to resume its life. It became the center of theological education. It became the center of church administration, and it became this huge center for Orthodox Christians to come together. And it was not closed again, I believe, since it was reopened by Stalin in '46. So St. Sergius was a huge figure in the development, not only of the Russian Orthodox Church, not only the development of monasticism, but in the development of the Russian identity, which is at its heart Orthodox, and with people committed to the life of the Church and committed to transforming their lives according to the life of the Church. At that time, monasticism was still. This was before the real hesychast revival, or rather, at the same time. How much communication there was? There's not much in the way of spiritual writings of St. Sergius, and very little from his period in Russia. However, there's another figure who is also extremely important, who was born maybe 20 years, give or take, after St. Sergius died. And that's St. Neil Sorsky, St. Neil of Sora. And St. Neil Sorsky was another great monastic founder. He was, I don't remember where exactly he was born, but as a young man, he traveled. And he traveled down to Palestine, to the Holy Land. He traveled to Greece and to Constantinople, and he went to the Holy Mountain, and he spent a considerable amount of time in the Holy Mountain. And this was in the 1400s. Now, think about what was going on in the 1400s. The Palamite controversies ended 1361. There's another element that is also important, is that there was a great plague that hit the city of Constantinople in the year 1346, and half the population died. Half the population. We can't even conceive of that, yeah.
What was the plague?
Like bubonic plague.
Okay.
It went all throughout Europe, and this was the era of the plague in Europe, in Western Europe as well. So, St. Neil was on the Holy Mountain. Well, maybe 100 years later, in the 1440s. 1453, if you remember, is when the Turks finally destroyed Constantinople, and when they finally put it under siege and conquered Constantinople. But that time from the Palamite councils, in fact, from the time of St. Gregory Palamas up until the 1450s, there was this very strong spiritual movement of hesychasm, which was pervading the monasteries in and around Constantinople, which of course would include Mount Athos. One of the things that's the most unique about St. Neil Sorsky is that he took really good notes. And in his, he hauled books with him. He obviously learned how to read Greek. And either he hauled the books back or he took really good notes. And so his writings are a remarkable and very clear and almost contemporary presentation of how to live as a hesychast. He had a very interesting philosophy too. He himself also had been a disciple of Saint Kirill Belozersky, Saint Cyril of White Lake. And Saint Kirill was one of those monks who was classed as a non-possessor. He fought against the principle of the monasteries owning land. The problem was not ownership of land. The problem was ownership of serfs and villages. And so there was a controversy in the late 15th century in Russia called the non-possessor controversy. Now, St. Nilus had every intention of living basically as a hesychast, absolutely simply, with no gold, no metal vessels, even for the Eucharist. They used wooden vessels. No jewels, no brocade vestments, nothing. No decoration, no luxury. Just very, very simply, a life entirely focused on the Jesus prayer and on Hezekiah, on silence. In other words, a very strict ascetic life. However, he and his monastic brother got pulled into a controversy of which their interlocutor was St. Joseph Walatzki. Now, St. Cyril, obviously, St. Nilus is a saint, St. Joseph Walatzki is a saint, but they were on opposite sides of this of this issue. And of course, St. Nilus took the side of his spiritual father in strictly opposing monastic ownership of serfs and of villages. Now, at the time, 1/3 of the territory, 1/3 of the property in Russia, was owned by the monasteries.
Wow.
Wow, 1/3. Now, the serfs actually liked to be under monastic ownership because the monks were kind. They didn't beat them, they didn't whip them, they didn't sell them off, they didn't, they basically left them alone, and they were Christian, unlike some of the other, masters, where serfdom was not quite so easy. However, the very principle of monastics owning serfs was something abhorrent to Saint Joseph, or to Saint Nilus and Saint Kirill and the non-possessors. Now, Saint Nilus lived on the river Sora, which is not too far from the Kirillo-Belozersky Monastery, White Lake, which is way northeast. It's even northeast of St. Petersburg. It's way out there. It's not quite to Siberia, but almost. Have you been there? Anybody? Yeah, Kirillo-Belozersky.
It's a wonderful place.
Yeah, there's some incredible
Beautiful.
frescoes.
Yes, fantastic.
So, so in the controversies, Saint Joseph Volotsky, who was the abbot of the Volokolamsk monastery, of which Metropolitan Hilarion Alfeyev is the titular bishop now, was involved in this controversy on the other side of the possessors. And so at the time, and all the way through the 20th, up into the 20th century, the monasteries had been beneficiaries of the largesse and the guilty consciences of the nobility. And so they would be given these remarkable gifts of gold and silver and and chalices studded with diamonds, and just as well as lands and serfs and villages. And the serfs were serfdom wasn't quite like slavery. The serfs were tied to the land, so you didn't have a market in serfs like you had a market in slaves. But when the land was transferred, the people who were attached to the land were transferred as well, and they owed the master some kind of payment. So many of the great monasteries, and if you've been to Russia, or if you've seen the pictures, some of these things are huge. That means lots and lots and lots and lots of money. And they're filled with gold, and they're filled with, treasures and things like that. And that's only what's left after the communists looted them for 75 years. Because the communists went through and they stripped the monasteries and they stripped the churches of all of their wealth. You want to see some of it, go to Hillwood over here.
Very
so-
large chalices.
Yeah, studded with gold and diamonds and stuff. So remarkable stuff. But But the real question is that necessary for the spiritual life, or is it a distraction? And of course, the non-possessors would say it's all a distraction. Because once you've got stuff, then you have to worry about the stuff. And you've got to keep it from being stolen, and so that creates possibility. And how are you supposed to sit in silence saying the Jesus prayer if you're worried about your stuff getting stolen? You know? On the other hand, you had the possessors, who rather liked all of the, shall we say, rather luxurious lifestyle that was provided by the friends of the monastery, by the nobility, for by their gifts and by the vast amounts of money that came in from the land and village holdings of the monasteries. Now, at various times, a little bit later on, especially under Peter the First, we don't call him Peter the Great because he was the first great persecutor of Orthodoxy in Russia, and under his daughter or granddaughter, Catherine.
Well, he had a daughter named Catherine.
Yeah.
Also, there was Catherine the Great.
Well, so-called.
So-called, right.
Yes. Who was another huge persecutor of Orthodoxy, who stripped the monasteries of their lands, and that caused financial disaster because the monasteries were no longer. They had to become dependent on the state instead of independent entities financially. And the reality is, if you have a community of several hundred people, and this is part of the argument for the possessors. If you have a community of several hundred people, it takes a lot of money and resources to support it. If you have 500 people who are living there in the monastery, and you have to feed 1,000 people a day of visitors, it takes a lot of resources. Think about it. It's just, having been in monastic administration, it's overwhelming to think about. We used to get, during the summers, we used to get 35 people for 3 meals a day. Now, especially when that consists of 18 to 22-year-olds, that's a lot of food. And it's really expensive. And you have to keep the boys busy, So, you laugh. Just wait. You think I'm joking, huh?
Yeah. Sorry to cut through.
And another thing that was really important about the monasteries, and remains so until this day, is that the monasteries had the granaries and the resources to be storehouses for times of famine. And nowadays, we've got irrigation, we've got all this fertilizer, we've got all this stuff, and so famines don't happen. I mean, even if there's a drought, they figure out a way to. And then there's world trade and grains and all of this stuff. Well, none of that happened in the 14th century. You lived on what you could produce. And so the monastery might have had, say there were 500 brothers in the monastery, and 5,000 serfs. How do you feed, and then 500 visitors a day? How do you feed 6,000 people a day for 2 years with no income and without refreshment of resources? Yeah, so this was actually a critical function of the monasteries, and it's still a critical function of the monasteries. In 1989, when or 1999, when the Americans crashed the Russian banks, and all the assets all disappeared. Vallam Monastery had just deposited its summer earnings with the intention that they were going to use those to buy the supplies for the winter, which had to be transported within the next month before the lake froze, because Vallam it's an island monastery, and you can't get there during the winter except by helicopter, and you can't transport huge amounts of goods for 500 people to last them 6 months by helicopter. It's just not feasible. And so I got a call from the abbot. He said, we're facing either evacuation or starvation, because all of their money had disappeared instantly overnight. And so one letter on the internet raised, immediately $150,000 US, and there was other monies that came in that went directly. The biggest donation was from Hawaii, who understand what it is to be an island. And that money allowed them to buy what was necessary to not only survive the winter, but to share with other monasteries. And I had the patriarch invited me to come over to say thank you to me for that work and for the letter, and also our monastery collected the money, and I was given a tour of some of the monasteries and their charitable efforts. And so you had monasteries, some of which had Western support, and some of which had no outside support, out of their own resources, feeding the local villages, feeding the local towns twice a day. Hundreds and hundreds of people twice a day. And so the monasteries were fulfilling the mission that they had. And it was also pretty neat to celebrate the liturgy with Patriarch Alexei, I have to say. But it was an amazing thing to see how the monastics reached, and both men's communities and women's communities reached out and provided for the needs of the people who otherwise would have starved. Because all of their money disappeared too. So the possessor, non-possessor, it was ultimately the possessors won in that controversy. And the whole hesychast movement that was kind of growing with Neil Sorsky and in those monasteries kind of retreated. And what's interesting is that the spirituality of the in the monasteries became this kind of external formalism. In other words, long services, endless services, endless prostrations. Everybody would do everybody would be synchronized in their making the sign of the cross and making their bows, and You know, and then you had monks wearing chains, and you had, you know, some of these odd kinds of things going on, and it was, and it was very formal. There wasn't, you didn't have the institution of eldership. You didn't have, undoubtedly, you had confessors and, you know, people hearing confessions and so forth, and spiritual fathers. But you didn't have that institution of discipleship to an elder, which is the heart and the soul of hesychast, and I would say the heart and the soul of normal Orthodox monasticism. Instead, there was the focus on external observance. And so there have been swings over the course of the centuries in various ways. The reintroduction of hesychasm happened at the end of the 18th century with the translation of the newly assembled Philokalia into Slavonic by St. Paisy Velichkovsky, and its distribution throughout the Russian and Ukrainian monasteries starting in the 1780s. And then up until 1917, about 10% of the Russian monasteries were renewed and reformed according to that and that order. So, does this kind of make sense and hold together? Okay. So this all sets the scene. Shall I go for another 10 minutes, 15 minutes or so?
Sure.
It's 7 after or so. So you had all this going on in Russia. You know, politically, you know, you had the Mongol horde, you know, which was exacting tribute out of all of these local princes who were fighting with one another, and even the horde couldn't keep them completely from fighting it, but it did quiet things down a bit. Of course, they did know how to exploit some of these rivalries. And so there was a rivalry evidently between Moscow and Vladimir. And thanks to the horde, Moscow came out on top. And as a result, the Metropolitan of Kiev, who was resident in Vladimir, moved to Moscow. Because Vladimir, you look at the Kremlin there, and it's, you know, it's a capital. It's an imperial capital. But that didn't end up being where the Russian capital was. So there's the ascendancy of certain cities and the descent of certain cities, and, you know, regional influence, and scholars say that without the Mongol yoke, the Russian state would probably not have formed in the way it did. So it's interesting, you know, historically, and they preferred the Mongol yoke to the Teutonic Knights, who were invading from the northwest, So that's kind of interesting. So that was what was going on in Russia. Back to Constantinople. So the end of the 14th century, beginning of the 15th century, you have within monasticism you have this powerful hesychast movement, but basically the city is in ruins. The actual imperial capital was outside the city, and there were several other successor states, Trebizond and Nicaea and all that were sometimes allied with or against. And at the same time, you had the Turks going through and picking off the various kingdoms. And so in the 15th century, one of the situations that happened was I don't remember the exact dates, but sometime around 1440, you had the Serbian king donating for the restoration of the walls. By 1453, you had a regiment of Serbian Christian soldiers fighting with the Turks because they were under Islamic control to take Constantinople. Constantinople was reduced to basically some walled villages within the walls of the city. It was very sad, kind of. There were something like 6,000 to 10,000 defenders against 80,000 Ottomans. And the deciding factor in the siege of Constantinople was cannons. Constantinople, of course, the walls were built by Theodosius. Theodosius reigned in 381. Okay, so the walls were pretty old. At that time, they were only 1,000 years old, and massive. But of course, having suffered disrepair for centuries, and then there were not that many people living within the walls, and some of them were Latins, and some of them were foreigners, and so there was this mix, and then and there was no money, and the Turkish Sultan was 21 years old, and was was strongly motivated to make a name for himself and to take the city. So it was the military history of it is quite interesting. A lot of the population barricaded themselves inside Hagia Sophia, and there were services going on, people entreating the Mother of God for her protection against the Turks. The emperor ended up stripping off his imperial regalia and perishing in battle with his troops as the Turks broke through the gates, or they broke through the walls in one point and then came through and opened up the gates. And they were surrounded both by regular troops as well as by ships. The Turks had a cannon. There was an Italian cannon maker who had initially offered his services to the Byzantines, but they couldn't afford him. And so he went and offered his services to the Turks, and made dozens of cannons. One type of which were huge. The only problem with it is it took 3 hours to reload.
Oh.
But it packed quite a wallop. And the Byzantines had cannons too, but they were not very efficient, and they would actually tear apart the walls on their recoil. So that wasn't very helpful.
Yeah.
So the Turks rode into Constantinople, and they broke into the church, and everybody in the church who wasn't killed was enslaved and sold. And there were 3 days of rape and pillage and looting. So it was a sad end to a great city, and even the church acknowledged that it was a sad, very sad thing, because there you could still see the remnants of what had once been a great city. So, what followed religiously was that the Turks, of course, and the Patriarch, I believe, was killed as well. However, and both of them had become Roman Catholics. But I believe it was Gennadius Scholaris who was chosen to be the new patriarch. Who was a Palamite, and fiercely Orthodox in his convictions, and so he was set up in the Church of the Holy Apostles. Hagia Sophia, of course, was made into a mosque, which was a huge symbolic gesture of the great cathedral of Christendom being made into a mosque. Church of the Holy Apostles is no small church either, and it became the head of what evolved into the Turkish millet, or the Ottoman millet. And what happened with that is that all of the Christian subjects of the Ottoman Empire were put under a single head, the Patriarch of Constantinople.
Wow.
And so, as it evolved, and this wasn't immediate, by the way, this took a while to evolve. And so eventually you had most of the patriarchs of the churches that were within the borders of the Ottoman Empire living in Constantinople. And so there was some relative freedom for Christianity. How much, I don't know, but it really began a kind of a dark ages. Now at the same time, Russia is throwing off the Mongol yoke, which finally it started in 1380 and was finished in 1480, where the Mongols were driven back, and so by 1480 Russia was entirely free, and the church was entirely free. Just before the fall of Constantinople, there was the Ecumenical Council of Florence Ferrara, where they succeeded in Constantinople was desperate for a crusade to save them from the Turks. That didn't happen, but the
I thought there was an effort in the 1440s for some kind of crusade to help Constantinople, wasn't there?
Oh, there were various efforts, but and in fact, one of them was the proposal by the Golden Horde, but the West wasn't interested, and so the Greeks were invited to this reunion council in 1438 to discuss reunion with the Latins, and thereby appease them to try and get them to send an army. Didn't work. There were a couple thousand people that showed up to defend Constantinople, and mostly merchants. um, that was when both the emperor and the patriarch conceded and became unions. So when there are some who draw a rather direct line, 1453, 1438, 1453. The apostasy of the emperor and the patriarch, and Constantinople was gone. Now this created a very interesting situation with Moscow. So 1438, the Council of Florence-Ferrare, and Isidore of Kiev is appointed as the new Metropolitan of Moscow. Actually, his title was still Metropolitan of Kiev, but effectively Metropolitan of Moscow. And he too signed on with the Union. In the Byzantine world, the Union didn't take, thanks to Saint Mark of Ephesus. He was the Archbishop. He was the Archbishop of Ephesus, and he absolutely opposed the union with Rome, and whatever the cost. And the Orthodox population followed his lead. However, among the hierarchy, Isidore, who had been appointed by the Patriarch to be Metropolitan in Moscow, followed the Patriarch and the Emperor, and became a union. And so Isidore went to Moscow, and he went into the Dormition Cathedral in the Kremlin to serve liturgy, and he commemorated the Pope. And he was basically ridden out on a rail. He did all right. He ended up as a cardinal in Italy. And he actually sent some troops to defend, like a few hundred troops to help defend Constantinople. Because it was kind of down to individual lords sending a few troops. But it was at that time that Moscow, or the other bishops in Russia, seeing the apostasy of the church in Constantinople, and the apostate bishop that they had sent, decided to elect their own bishop. And so they took Metropolitan Jonah of Ryazan, and he was elected without consultation with Constantinople. Of course, Constantinople by that time was Roman Catholic. And that was the effective beginning of the autocephaly of the Russian Orthodox Church, with the election of a bishop without external confirmation as Metropolitan.
What did you call it? The
Autocephaly.
CEPH.
Now, Constantinople didn't accept the autocephaly until 1579, and even then, like right now, they're wanting to question it. So the Russian Church was completely self-governing from that point onwards. Up until that time, until say 1440, I think was about the date, it had been under Constantinople.
So did Moscow become, like, in effect, the new Constantinople?
Well, there was a whole lot of discussion at the time that Moscow was the third Rome. The first Rome fell to the barbarians, the second Rome fell to heresy, and so Moscow is the third Rome, and a fourth there shall never be. So that's not very popular in Constantinople. And I don't think they pay much attention to it in Italy either. But it never really made it to the level of a powerful ideology. However, what did develop in Moscow, in Russia, was the idea of the symphony between the church and the state, with the idea of a divinely anointed czar. In other words, the continuation of the Byzantine model, and that, of course, persisted until 1917, not without problems along the way. And there were plenty of problems, and they had rather different approaches to certain things, but really it was as much of a continuation of the Roman model as anywhere. So. Okay. So, questions, comments?
This is not really related to the topic, but since you sort of brought it up, do you think anything is going to happen around autocephaly and Ukraine and Constantinople there?
Well, if they do give the schismatic groups autocephaly, which I can't imagine they will, it will cause a schism, as Metropolitan Hilarion Alfeyev says, it will cause a schism like 1054.
Wow.
Except who would go with Constantinople at this point, besides Ukraine, and
Well, probably
Russia is much more powerful.
probably the Greek-speaking churches. You know, the modernist churches. You know, Western Europe, the OCA, Finns, Czechs, Poles probably. And I don't know how independent the Greeks would be. Antioch might go with the Russians. Jerusalem might go with the Russians. But their bread is buttered their bread is buttered in Greece, not in Constantinople. They get their bread from Constantinople, but it's buttered in Greece. Jerusalem's in a very difficult situation.
Yeah.
So I'm sure they would count on the Greek churches as remaining with them, and Moscow would certainly count on the Serbs, probably on Greece, the Church of Greece. Church of Greece is quite conservative. The canonical Ukrainian Church. Constantinople has gone in and divided the church before. They did it in Estonia. And certainly in North America, it's very problematic. And a lot of it is a dispute about who has the right to grant autocephaly and how it's to be granted, but also what are the rights and privileges of the Patriarch of Constantinople. They have an interpretation of one of the canons of the Fourth Ecumenical Council, which says that they have equal rights with Rome, Old Rome. Now, the way they interpret that, and that they have jurisdiction over all the barbarian lands. Well, at that time, their jurisdiction was defined as Thrace, Pontus, and Asia, which are 3 states surrounding the Bosporus. But what constitutes barbarian lands? Are we a barbarian land? I don't think so. So it's very problematic, and Constantinople. I don't think Constantinople would isolate itself by doing that and causing a vast schism worldwide. 2/3 of all Orthodox Christians are in the Russian Orthodox Church. So
It would be a bad move for them, I think.
yeah. And on one, and the other thing too, how do you validate sin? Philaret, the so-called Patriarch of Kiev, was defrocked for good reason. For corruption, basically. How can you validate, restoring him? I don't think so. And for the sin of schism. Not to mention, they're sending their priests and bishops to bless the weapons to go kill Russians. Their Orthodox brethren. That's not. That's not kosher. It may be very kosher, but it's not. It's not Orthodox. It's the whole issue of Ukraine is a huge problem, and an American intervention has only made things much more confusing. And American meddling in Russia has also made things much worse.
We would never meddle.
Well, no, we control. We go in and control. It's called the 90s, right? and it backfired. So what else?
Thanks for letting me listen in, but I think I need to go.
Okay.
So
But we're about to break up anyway.
You had mentioned that under the Mongols they divided it up into 3 different sectors. Was there major differences in how the monastics or the churches or the leadership were affected by that breakup?
Well, the monastics weren't, and the church. I'm sure those were definite kind of metropolitan districts. There was a metropolitan over each one. That would be an interesting study. And Belarusia and Ukraine, well, Ukraine has multiple districts that are very kind of unique. I don't know about Belarusia, but I think it's a little more homogeneous. And Russia is not homogeneous at all.
Yeah.
So, but the history is amazing. So this is an invitation to do further reading. Lots and lots and lots and lots of further reading. So anything else? Shall we pray? It is truly me to bless thee, Theotokos, ever blessed and most pure, and the Mother of our God, more honorable than the cherubim, more glorious beyond compare than the seraphim, who without corruption gave us birth to God the Word, truth that took us, we magnify him. The blessing of the Lord be upon you, through his grace and love from mankind, always now and ever into ages and ages. Amen.
Peaceful.
Bless you.